Welcome to GamingBolt, and today we're going to be taking a look at Lost Sphear from Tokyo RPG Factory, the same studio behind the retro-esque I Am Setsuna. Classics like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI still very much remain in our collective consciousness. JRPGs have grown beyond recognition throughout their long life of over 3 decades, and many things that were once considered staples of the genre are now nothing more than memories of a bygone era of the gaming industry. But these games are still widely considered to be among the greatest of all time, and try though people might, not many games have managed to recapture their magic in all the years that have passed since their initial releases. Now, Tokyo RPG Factory seems to have been set up by Square Enix for that specific purpose, to recapture the charm and brilliance of classic JRPGs by recreating their style of gameplay and storytelling in today's modern landscape. Their first effort, I Am Setsuna, didn't come close to doing that, despite having a fair share of its own strengths, but having learned from their past mistakes and efforts, the developers have made a concerted effort to accomplish this with Lost Sphear. And though I can safely say that Lost Sphear still isn't the kind of instant classic the developers may have been hoping it would be, it's a solid JRPG in its own right, which accomplishes quite a lot. Now, if you've seen Lost Sphear, you'd probably guess that the biggest strengths and weaknesses both stem from the same thing. That is the very premise of the game. It takes inspiration from a number of the genre's greatest titles, from Final Fantasy VI to Chrono Trigger to Xenogears. And in attempting to recreate that perfect old-school JRPG experience, Lost Sphear ends up exuding that kind of charm and focused simplicity that you don't often see in games these days. It also ends up feeling quite unremarkable in many aspects. As a result of that very reliance on nostalgia and old-school game design, it's solid and a great deal of fun, but unremarkable as a whole. Let's take a closer look at the game's story. Lost Sphear tells the story of Kanata, an orphan boy living an idyllic village life with his fellow orphan friends. But when things, places, and people mysteriously start vanishing into white plumes of nothingness, he's thrust into events far beyond his understanding. He realizes he has the ability to restore these lost objects by making use of the memories they leave behind, since these memories are, in a way, what gives everything shape and form. With this newfound power, Kanata and his companions get pulled into a story that escalates quite quickly, as far-reaching consequences for the world in more ways than one. Now let's be completely honest, the foundation itself lacks originality, and it's a fairly generic setup in tone and style, especially if you're familiar with the kind of old JRPGs Lost Sphear tries to imitate. The game has to be given credit though for building on it in commendable ways. The plot moves at a brisk pace, and there's always enough to keep the player invested in the events, to keep you curious about what happens next. There's a few twists and turns along the way, and pleasantly enough, quite a lot of them are hard to predict and will genuinely surprise you. The concept of memories being, in essence, the ultimate life force for not just people, but inanimate objects as well, is also an interesting one, and the game keeps finding ways to make use of it, utilizing it for both personal tales and stories of large-scale consequences. Lost Sphear's plot is often let down by some shoddy writing though. Like the JRPGs that it's trying so hard to emulate, Lost Sphear has a serious issue with heavy-handed exposition, and oftentimes it emits a frustrating lack of subtlety. Over the years, the RPG genre has started showing signs of becoming mature enough to realize the importance of the mantra, show, don't tell. Lost Sphear seems to have a complete lack of that understanding. All too often the game feels the need to bombard the player with unnecessary cutscenes with overly long dialogue and overzealous explanations of things that would have been better left to interpretation. As if that weren't bad enough, the characters are just as regressive. Almost all of them fit into tropes and genre conventions so well that they almost seem to be the very definitions of said tropes. That's not to say they're bad characters per se, but for the most part, given how generic they are, it's just a little hard to care too much about them, which is a shame because they have well-defined traits and backstories, and a few of them are likable enough. Thankfully, like I Am Setsuna, Lost Sphear does a much better job of creating a combat system that's a balanced mixture of old and new. It's essentially a turn-based combat system with an ATB bar similar to Final Fantasy games of old, but the game continues to add plenty of layers on top of this core to make for a deceptively deep system. For starters, when you're in the middle of turns, you can freely move your characters about on the battlefield, which lets you use their positioning to your benefit, such as being able to hit multiple enemies with the same attack, or being able to evade certain enemy attacks. In and of itself, this mechanic lends an added layer of strategy to battles, especially in some of the more challenging fights, where figuring out the tells of enemies' attacks in order to evade them beforehand adds a unique twist of urgency and an extra bit of challenge. Then there's the momentum bar, which keeps filling up as battles progress, and with the press of a button at the right time, allows you to deal boosted damage to enemies. It's a pretty simple move both in definition and in practice, but in the heat of battle, when you have to keep an eye on it, while also remaining aware of all your enemies and their attacks, landing the right momentum strike at the right time against the right enemy can give you a significant edge. There are also Sprint Knights to use, which by definition are basically your mana moves, but these two have an added layer of strategy. Each Sprint Knight move can also be equipped with momentum, which can provide some quite useful buffs and debuffs. And then there are artifacts, so-called lost items in the overworld that you can restore using memories to give you added boosts and abilities. After the first few hours, Lost Sphear also throws Valco Suits into the mix, which are basically huge mech suits which let you both deal and take massive amounts of damage. Though the concept of Valco Suits is an interesting one, Lost Sphear unfortunately fails to ever make use of them properly. The use of Valco Suits is governed by the VP meter, which at least, until very late into the game, depletes at a pretty alarming rate, meaning that these suits are best left unused until you're in desperate need of them, such as instances when you have to get past a particularly tough boss. Otherwise, this all makes for a combat system that has a surprising amount of depth and strategy involved and continues to be entertaining throughout the course of the game. However, speaking about those boss battles, there are quite a few tough ones. Almost unfairly so, in fact. Too many times in my playthrough, I ran into bosses that brought about astonishing spikes in difficulty, many of whom were in fact able to wipe out my entire party with their first few attacks without even giving me the chance to make a single move of my own. Now, I'm all for challenging boss battles, especially in RPGs, but there's challenging and then there's bad shit insane. The boss battles in Lost Sphear all too often fall into the latter category. Outside of these bosses though, the game's difficulty is almost leisurely. Dungeon design is for the most part simple and straightforward, while there are no random battles, either in the dungeons nor in the overworld, so exploration, while never as much of an emphasis as it often is in RPGs, is always a pleasure, light though it may be. If you're still reminded of the phrase solid but unremarkable when it comes to Lost Sphear, you're not wrong. The phrase solid but unremarkable also pervades the game's production values as well, and a huge reason for that is its goal to emulate the classic JRPGs of old. Cutscenes have no voice acting, so emotions and feelings are portrayed through on-screen prompts on top of characters' heads. A drop of sweat signifying embarrassment or uncertainty, an exclamation point emoting surprise or awe, you get the drift. The soundtrack consists of a number of melodies that fit the game's themes and story beats almost perfectly, all of which are hummable, to be sure, but might not rank among your favorite tracks of the year. Despite the old-school presentation, Lost Sphear is a very good-looking game. It has a top-down fixed camera perspective akin to RPGs of the late 80s and early 90s, and has a very similar sprite-based look. Only instead of sprites, it makes use of 3D polygonal models and assets. It's got a clean, simplistic look that has a unique charm of its own, and though it doesn't do anything extraordinary or doesn't break any barriers, its attractive art style has to be complimented all the same. The overworld looks great for the most part, while a number of locations are very well designed, such as a graveyard of hulking, scattered ships and galleys, or an industrial city that spews smog all over the island. That said, there are plenty of instances when the game reuses several of its assets, such as the interiors of buildings, like inns, and that sort of laziness is hard to overlook. With so many classic JRPGs that you can always revisit, or visit if you've never played them before, that would give you a much better experience, it's really hard to recommend Lost Sphear. It's a very enjoyable and well-made game, don't get us wrong, but then there's also the fact that at least right now at launch, Lost Sphear is priced at a bafflingly steep $50, and I don't think it completely justifies a purchase at that price, not when there's so many other, much better games on the market that you can purchase for pretty much the same amount of money. It once again goes back to Lost Sphear being a victim of its very own premise, the same premise it also benefits from in many ways. The focused simplicity and old-school charm are pleasantly refreshing, especially in a genre that seems to be insistent on constantly one-upping itself with complex webs of mechanics and vast, sweeping adventures. However, in trying to achieve that old-school charm, Lost Sphear ends up failing to do anything that can make it stand out on its own in this day and age. That'll be it for this video. If you like what we're doing, please go ahead and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.